It required a chaotic eruption of gunfire within a crack house to finally shatter Todd Bridges' cultivated image as a wholesome child star. While Gary Coleman and Dana Plato suffered a slow, agonizing disintegration, Todd seemed determined to crash much faster through narcotics and gang violence, appearing destined to become the third victim of the Diff'rent Strokes curse. However, Todd refused to be just another obituary, miraculously surviving a heart-stopping overdose and escaping a life sentence thanks to the legendary Johnny Cochran. He stands today as the defiance of the pattern, the solitary child star who stared down the same demons that killed Gary and Dana, but against all odds, lived to tell the tale. Todd was born into the aristocracy of Black Hollywood. On May 27, 1965, in San Francisco, California, he entered a world where performance was the family trade. His mother, Betty Alice Bridges, was a respected actress, director, and manager. She understood the mechanics of the industry better than the studio executives themselves. His father, James, was a talent agent. For the Bridges family, a film set was not a place of fantasy. It was the office. It was the factory floor. When the family relocated to Los Angeles, the City of Angels was undergoing a cultural metamorphosis. The 1970s were a time of gritty realism and burgeoning opportunity. Todd, even as a toddler, possessed a kinetic energy that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't just cute, he was charismatic. He had an innate timing, a way of delivering a line or a look that belied his single-digit age. Betty Bridges, careful and protective, did not push him. She guided him. She knew the sharks that swam in these waters. But Todd's talent was an undeniable current. By the mid-1970s, he was a working actor, a professional in a child's body. He landed recurring roles in the acclaimed police sitcom Barney Miller and its spin-off Fish. He was building a resume that many adult actors would envy. He was disciplined, he was professional, and he was ready for the role that would define and nearly destroy his life. The year was 1978. The landscape of American television was shifting under the guidance of Norman Lear, the legendary producer who had shattered taboos with All in the Family. Lear and his team were developing a high-concept sitcom that would test the racial temperature of the country. The premise was bold, if not slightly contrived. A wealthy white businessman, Philip Drummond, living in a penthouse on Park Avenue, adopts the two sons of his deceased African-American housekeeper from Harlem. The show was titled Diff'rent Strokes. The casting directors had found their younger brother Arnold in a dynamo of energy named Gary Coleman. Coleman was a phenomenon, a child with the verbal dexterity of a comedian and a medical condition that kept him perpetually small, giving him an eternal non-threatening cuteness. But they needed an anchor. They needed Willis. Willis Jackson had to be the bridge. He had to be street smart enough to represent Harlem, but adaptable enough to fit into the high society of Manhattan. He had to be the straight man to Gary's antics, the protective older brother who grounded the show in reality. Todd Bridges walked into the audition, and the chemistry was instantaneous. He didn't just play Willis, he embodied the cool, skeptical yet loving energy the character required. When the pilot aired, the reaction was seismic. Diff'rent Strokes was not just a hit, it was a cultural juggernaut. It premiered on NBC and rocketed to the top of the ratings. For the first time, millions of white families in the suburbs were inviting two young black boys into their living rooms every week. Todd Bridges, Gary Coleman, and Dana Plato became instant royalty. They were the Diff'rent Strokes kids. They were on lunchboxes, t-shirts, and magazine covers. They were the faces of a new integrated generation. But beneath the laughter of the studio audience, a complex and toxic dynamic was beginning to curdle. Fame is a drug, and like all drugs, the high is followed by a crash. For Todd, the high was the money, the adoration, and the thrill of performance. The crash was the realization of his place in the hierarchy. Gary Coleman was the breakout star. His catchphrase, "What you talking about, Willis?" became a verbal virus, repeated in schoolyards and office break rooms across the globe. Todd found himself in a peculiar hell. He was famous, but he was famous for being the setup. He was the canvas upon which Gary painted his comedy. The scripts increasingly marginalized Willis. He became the foil, the responsible buzzkill. While the public saw a happy, blended family, the reality for the actors was a profound isolation. They were children carrying the economic weight of a network. They worked adult hours. They dealt with adult pressures. And the industry, sensing blood in the water, began to circle. To grasp Todd Bridges' challenging path from child stardom on Diff'rent Strokes to later personal hardships, we must consider the deep-seated difficulties that shaped his early years. Media often simplified his story as one of a young actor struggling with sudden fame, depicting him as defiant or unprepared. In truth, it stemmed from unresolved childhood experiences that lingered for years. Bridges later shared in his writings a painful ordeal from age 11, just before filming began, which influenced his long-term well-being. This insight underscores how unaddressed early issues can alter trajectories, beyond surface-level explanations of fame's pitfalls. The perpetrator was not a stranger in a dark alley. It was a publicist, a man who was a friend of the family, a person trusted by his parents and the industry. This was the dark underbelly of 1970s Hollywood, an era where access to children was unregulated, where mentors operated without oversight, and where silence was the currency of ambition. The abuse shattered Todd's developing psyche. It stripped him of his agency and planted a deep, festering seed of self-hatred. He felt dirty, he felt complicit, and worst of all, he felt he could tell no one. To speak out would be to disrupt the business, to shame his family, to break the illusion. So he fractured. On the soundstage, he was Willis, the moral compass, the good son, the protector. Off the soundstage, he was a traumatized boy screaming into a void, trying to numb a mind that was constantly replaying his victimization. By the time he was 15, the pressure cooker of fame and the suppressed trauma became unbearable. Todd needed an escape valve. He found it in marijuana. It started innocently enough, or as innocently as drug use can start in Hollywood. It was a way to relax, a way to fit in with the older crowds that hung around the studios, a way to turn down the volume of the screaming in his head. The weed softened the edges of his reality. It made the jealousy over Gary Coleman's salary easier to swallow. It made the memories of the abuse fade into a hazy background noise. But in the high-stakes, high-velocity environment of 1980s Los Angeles, marijuana was merely the appetizer. The city was awash in cocaine. It was the era of excess, and Todd Bridges had the bank account to participate. As the seasons of Diff'rent Strokes wore on, the cute kids grew up. The writers struggled to find storylines for a teenage Willis. The ratings began to slip. The cute factor that had protected them was evaporating. As the studio lights dimmed for the final time in 1986, the darkness that descended on Todd Bridges was not just literal, it was existential. The structured chaos of the television set, which had been his entire world since childhood, was replaced by a terrifying void. The protective bubble of the Diff'rent Strokes production office burst, leaving him exposed to a reality he was ill-equipped to navigate. He was a young man with a recognizable face but no identity, standing on the precipice of a cliff that he couldn't yet see. The fall wouldn't be immediate, but the ground beneath him was already crumbling. The silence that followed the applause was not peaceful. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled by the loudest, most destructive forces available. If the cancellation of Diff'rent Strokes in 1986 was a death, the years that followed were the purgatory. For 8 years, Todd Bridges had lived by a schedule dictated by assistant directors and network executives. His life was a series of call times, table reads, and rehearsals. He was an essential cog in a multi-million-dollar machine. When the machine stopped, the silence was deafening. At 21 years old, Todd faced a crisis that few adults, let alone young men, are equipped to handle: obsolescence. In the eyes of Hollywood casting directors, he was not Todd Bridges, the versatile actor. He was Willis Jackson, a cultural artifact of the late 70s. He was too famous to be anonymous, but too typecast to be employable. He would walk into auditions for dramatic roles, gritty, serious characters, and producers would look at him and see only the sitcom brother. They couldn't hire him. His face alone would break the audience's suspension of disbelief. The rejection was personal and constant. The phone, which had been his lifeline to validation, stopped ringing. The entourage of friends who had enjoyed his generosity and his access suddenly evaporated. Left alone in his mansion, with a bank account that was hemorrhaging cash and a mind still reeling from unprocessed trauma, Todd found himself staring into the abyss. The structure that had held his life together was gone. The only thing that remained was the hunger for relief, for escape, for a way to turn off the silence. The late 1980s in Los Angeles marked the arrival of a new, devastating predator: crack cocaine. Unlike the powdered cocaine of the disco era, which was associated with glamour, Wall Street, and high-functioning addiction, crack was different. It was cheap, it was dirty, and it was violently addictive. It hit the brain like a sledgehammer, providing a fleeting, intense euphoria followed by a crash so profound that the user would do literally anything to regain the high. For a young man with a hole in his soul and hundreds of thousands of dollars at his disposal, crack was not just a drug, it was a solution. Todd's transition from marijuana and recreational cocaine to crack was the turning point. It was the moment the bad boy narrative ceased to be a tabloid exaggeration and became a terrifying reality. The drug stripped him of his vanity first. The athletic, handsome physique of Willis Jackson withered. His skin grew sallow. His eyes, once bright with the timing of a comedic prodigy, grew dark and paranoid. The financial ruin was catastrophic. A crack habit is a voracious beast. It does not eat in moderation. Todd burned through his savings with frightening speed. The residuals from Diff'rent Strokes, checks that should have set him up for life, were cashed and smoked within days of arriving. He sold his cars. He sold his investments. He sold his dignity. There is a specific image from this era that, in hindsight, serves as the most painful irony of Todd Bridges' life. In 1983, at the height of Diff'rent Strokes mania, the show aired a special 2-part episode titled The Reporter. The guest star was none other than First Lady Nancy Reagan. She was there to promote her Just Say No anti-drug campaign. In the episode, Todd Bridges, as Willis, helps uncover a drug ring at his school. He stands beside the First Lady, a soldier in the war on drugs, a beacon of moral clarity for American youth. Less than 5 years later, the boy who stood next to Nancy Reagan was prowling the streets of South Central Los Angeles, doing exactly what he had warned America not to do. The fall was absolute. Todd was no longer just a user. To sustain a habit that cost hundreds of dollars a day, he crossed the line into distribution. He began dealing. This was a dangerous evolution. He was now operating in a world far removed from the security of the studio lot. He was navigating a landscape of gangs, desperate addicts, and ruthless suppliers. He carried a gun not for a prop but for survival. The paranoia induced by the methamphetamine and crack made him volatile. He was convinced he was being watched, being followed, being hunted. By 1988, the transformation was complete. Todd Bridges was effectively homeless, bouncing between drug dens known as crack houses and cheap motels. These were fortified bunkers where sunlight was banned and time did not exist. In these houses, the hierarchy of Hollywood meant nothing. The only currency was the rock. Todd was often recognized by fellow addicts, a surreal moment where the ghost of Willis Jackson would be acknowledged by someone holding a glass pipe. "Hey, aren't you the guy from TV?" they would ask. And Todd, high and broken, would have to admit that he was. The legal troubles began to mount, serving as warning shots that he ignored. There was a weapons charge in 1983. In 1987, he received a suspended sentence for making bomb threats against a mechanic in a dispute over a car repair, an act of manic aggression fueled by chemical imbalance. But these were merely tremors before the earthquake. Todd was spiraling toward a violent collision with reality. He was surrounding himself with dangerous men, people who saw him not as a friend, but as a mark or a rival. One of these men was Kenneth "Tex" Clay. February 1989. The location was a drug house in South Central Los Angeles. The atmosphere was thick with smoke and the jagged electric tension of sleep deprivation. Todd Bridges was there. Kenneth Clay was there. The exact details of what transpired in that room have been debated, dissected, and reconstructed in court, but the outcome is undisputed. Bridges and Clay had a history. There was bad blood fueled by drug debts and the erratic behavior of two men deep in the throes of addiction. In the warped reality of a crack house, a look or a word can be interpreted as a death threat. Todd, in a state of what would later be described as cocaine psychosis, believed he was in imminent danger. His mind, ravaged by days of sleeplessness and chemical toxicity, told him that Clay was about to kill him. The survival instinct, the primal urge that had been twisted by abuse and addiction, took over. Todd Bridges drew a .25 caliber pistol. The sound of the gunshots was small, popping sounds in the enclosed room, but the consequences were massive. He fired until the weapon clicked empty, unleashing a volatile spray of lead. Kenneth Clay was struck 4 times in the throat and chest. He collapsed, bleeding out on the floor of the den. Panic ensued. Todd fled the scene, a fugitive in his own city. Miraculously, Kenneth Clay did not die. The small caliber of the bullets and the grace of Providence spared his life. But for Todd Bridges, the damage was done. He had crossed the final line. He was no longer just a troubled child star. He was an attempted murderer. The Los Angeles Police Department did not have to look hard to find him. When they arrested Todd Bridges, the footage was beamed around the world. The image was shocking. Willis Jackson in handcuffs. His face was gaunt, unshaven, and terrified. He looked older than his 23 years, aged by a decade of hard living. The charges were severe: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon. The district attorney was not interested in mercy. They saw a celebrity who had squandered his privilege and turned to violence. They wanted to make an example of him. Todd was denied bail. He was thrown into the Los Angeles County Jail, a brutal facility where his fame made him a target for every inmate looking to make a name for themselves. With the heavy steel door of his cell slammed shut, the reality of his predicament began to set in. The boy who had once been protected by agents and publicists was now at the mercy of a legal system that chewed up young black men with indifference. The headlines had already convicted him. The public had already written him off. But the legal arena is a theater of its own, and the stage was being set for a second act that no screenwriter could have plausibly invented. Todd needed more than a lawyer. He needed a miracle worker who could translate the language of the streets into the language of the law. As he shivered through withdrawal in the county jail, help was arriving in the form of a legal titan who was about to turn the courtroom into a battleground for Todd's very soul. When Todd Bridges sat in the Los Angeles County Jail in 1989, his world had shrunk to the dimensions of a 6-by-8 cell. He was facing charges that carried a maximum sentence of life in prison. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Witnesses placed him at the scene. The gun was his, and the victim, Kenneth Tex Clay, had identified him as the shooter. To the district attorney, it was an open and shut case of a celebrity junkie losing control. But Todd Bridges had one card left to play. His family, rallying despite the chaos he had brought into their lives, secured the services of a defense attorney who was already a legend in the black community of Los Angeles, though not yet a household name globally. His name was Johnny L. Cochran, Jr. Years before he would captivate the world with the defense of O.J. Simpson, Cochran was honing his craft in the trenches of the Los Angeles Superior Court. He was a master tactician, a man who understood that a trial was not just about facts. It was about narrative. He knew that to save Todd Bridges, he didn't have to prove Todd was a saint. He just had to prove that the alternative, imprisonment for a man acting out of sheer terror, was a greater injustice. Cochran looked at the case file and saw what the prosecutors missed. They saw a cold-blooded attempted murder. Cochran saw a desperate act of self-preservation by a man whose mind had been hijacked by chemicals. He saw the cocaine psychosis. The trial began in a media frenzy. Cameras lined the hallways. The headlines were brutal. Willis on trial for life. The public, hungry for the fall of a star, watched with bated breath. Cochran's strategy was high risk and legally complex. He did not attempt to argue that Todd wasn't in the room. He didn't argue that Todd didn't pull the trigger. To do so would have insulted the jury's intelligence given the physical evidence. Instead, he argued intent. In California law, attempted murder requires malice aforethought, a specific intent to kill. Cochran argued that Todd Bridges, in the throes of a massive cocaine binge, was incapable of forming that intent. He introduced the concept of unconscious act induced by intoxication. Cochran painted a vivid, terrifying picture of the drug house. He described it as a war zone where paranoia was the only rational state of mind. He characterized Kenneth Clay not as an innocent victim, but as a dangerous predator, a drug dealer who had threatened Todd in the past. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cochran would argue, his voice filling the courtroom, "Todd Bridges did not go there to kill. He went there to die slowly. And when he was threatened, his survival instinct, primitive, distorted, but real, took over. He systematically dismantled the prosecution's witnesses. These were not upstanding citizens. They were fellow addicts and dealers, their memories foggy with smoke and self-interest. Cochran exposed their inconsistencies. He asked the jury to look at Todd, gaunt, trembling, clearly broken, and ask themselves if this looked like a calculated killer or a terrified boy in a man's body. The jury deliberated for days. The tension in the Bridges camp was unbearable. A conviction meant the end of Todd's life as he knew it. He would likely die in prison. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Todd stood up, his hands clasping the defense table, his knuckles white. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Todd Anthony Bridges, not guilty." The words hung in the air. Not guilty of attempted murder, not guilty of assault with a deadly weapon. The courtroom erupted. Tears streamed down Todd's face. He collapsed into Cochran's arms. The jury had accepted the defense. They believed that while Todd had shot Clay, he had done so in a state of fear and delirium so profound that it negated criminal intent. He was convicted only of the lesser charge, illegal possession of a firearm concealed in a vehicle. It was a slap on the wrist compared to the life sentence he had faced. Todd Bridges walked out of the courthouse a free man. The press hailed it as a miracle. Johnny Cochran had pulled a rabbit out of a hat. But as the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted questions, few noticed the look in Todd's eyes. It wasn't just relief, it was emptiness. He was free, yes, but he was still an addict, and the demon that had put him in that courtroom was still waiting for him outside. There is a common misconception that hitting rock bottom automatically leads to recovery. For Todd, the trial was a false bottom. He had stared into the abyss of prison and blinked, but the addiction was patient. The acquittal in 1990 should have been a wake-up call. It should have been the moment he checked into rehab and never looked back. Instead, the lack of consequences fed the disease. His addict brain whispered a dangerous lie. You are invincible. You beat the system. You can handle this. The years following the acquittal were, in many ways, darker than the years before. The adrenaline of the trial faded, replaced by the crushing boredom of unemployment. Hollywood was done with him. He was now toxic, an actor with a rap sheet and a drug problem. No insurance company would bond him for a film set. So, the cycle resumed. 1990, arrested again on drug charges. 1991, arrested again. 1992, caught with methamphetamine and a loaded gun. The public sympathy that had flickered during the trial was extinguished. He became a punchline on late-night talk shows. He was the poster child for child star failure. He was living in a state of perpetual numbness, moving from high to high, burning through the last of his goodwill and his health. The body can only endure so much. The human heart is a resilient engine, but it is not designed to run on rocket fuel for a decade. In early 1993, the inevitable happened. Todd had been on a massive binge, days of methamphetamines and cocaine, no sleep, no food, just chemical fire. He was at a friend's house when the world suddenly tilted on its axis. His chest tightened. The air seemed to vanish from the room. He collapsed. Todd Bridges went into cardiac arrest. For several minutes he was clinically dead. His heart stopped beating. The electrical impulses that drove his life ceased. He was a corpse on a floor in Los Angeles. Paramedics arrived and worked frantically. They shocked his heart once, twice. They pushed drugs into his veins to restart the engine. And then, with a gasp that sounded like a tear in the fabric of reality, he came back. He woke up in a hospital bed, tubes running in and out of his body, the steady beep of a monitor confirming that he was, against all odds, alive. A doctor stood over him, his face grim. "Mr. Bridges," the doctor said, "you shouldn't be here. By all medical logic, you should be dead." This was the true rock bottom. Not the jail cell, not the courtroom, but the void of death. Todd later described this moment as a spiritual awakening. He realized that the acquittal in the Clay trial wasn't a pass to keep using. It was a deferred sentence. God or the universe or fate had given him a reprieve. But this second chance, this resurrection from cardiac arrest, was the final warning. There would be no third act if he didn't rewrite the script now. On February 24th, 1993, Todd Bridges made a decision that was harder than facing a jury. He decided to live. He entered rehab. But this time, he didn't do it to save his career or to please a judge. He did it to save his soul. The withdrawal was agony. The physical pain was eclipsed only by the psychological torment of facing the wreckage of his life without a chemical buffer. He had to mourn his lost youth. He had to mourn the money he burned. He had to mourn the trust he broke. He had to learn who Todd Bridges was without Willis Jackson and without the drugs. While Todd wrestled his own demons into submission, clawing his way back from the brink of death to a fragile sobriety, the world outside was not so kind to his former family. As he began the slow, painful climb out of the grave he had dug for himself, he was forced to watch in horror as the history he shared with his co-stars began to rot. His resurrection stood in stark, painful contrast to the trajectory of the others. He had escaped the curse through a combination of luck and divine intervention, but the shadow that had covered him for so long was now moving to engulf the only two people on earth who truly understood his childhood. The survivor's guilt he felt wasn't abstract. It was a daily realization that while he was healing, his on-screen siblings were dying. As Todd Bridges clawed his way out of the darkness in the mid-1990s, achieving a fragile but growing sobriety, the world turned its gaze to the other members of the Diff'rent Strokes family. The media had long speculated about a curse, a sensationalist term used to sell tabloids. But as the millennium approached, the curse began to look less like a myth and more like a statistical inevitability. The first domino to fall was Dana Plato. On screen, she had been Kimberly Drummond, the effervescent, wholesome teenage girl who seemed to have it all. In reality, Dana was fighting demons that mirrored Todd's. She struggled with drug addiction, poverty, and a desperate need for the validation that had been stripped away when she was written off the show due to her pregnancy in 1984. Todd and Dana had remained in contact. They shared a bond that no one else could understand, the trauma of being child gods who were discarded when they ceased to be cute. Todd had tried to encourage her toward sobriety, sharing his own hard-won battles, but Dana's path was steeper. In May 1999, the news broke. Dana Plato was dead at the age of 34. She did not die in a mansion. She did not die in a hospital surrounded by top-tier medical staff. She died in a cramped, sweltering recreational vehicle in Moore, Oklahoma. She had taken a lethal dose of painkillers and muscle relaxants. The Golden Girl of NBC had passed away in obscurity, leaving behind a son who would later tragically take his own life, compounding the generational trauma. For Todd, the news was a physical blow. It was a reminder of how close he had come to the edge. He was the bad one, the one with the rap sheet. Dana was the good one. And yet she was gone, and he was still here. The survivor's guilt began to take root, a heavy, silent passenger in his mind. Then there was Gary. Gary Coleman was the son around which the Diff'rent Strokes universe orbited. He was a comedic genius, a child who carried the weight of a network on his small shoulders. But his life was perhaps the most tragic of all. Gary suffered from a congenital kidney defect that stunted his growth and required daily dialysis and multiple transplants. As he grew older, the industry that had fetishized his small stature turned its back on him. He was trapped in the body of a child, but possessed the mind of a bitter, intelligent, and frustrated man. His financial ruin was absolute. Gary discovered that his parents and business managers had misappropriated nearly all of his earnings. Millions of dollars siphoned away while he worked tirelessly. He sued them and won, but the money was largely gone. The humiliation was public. The boy who had charmed the First Lady was reduced to working as a security guard in a shopping mall. He was mocked by the public he once entertained. He became a fixture on reality TV shows, trading his dignity for a paycheck. Todd watched from a distance, heartbroken. He saw the anger in Gary, the rage at a world that refused to see him as a man. In May 2010, the final act of the tragedy played out. Gary Coleman fell in his home in Utah, suffering an epidural hematoma. He died at the age of 42. With Gary's death, the triumvirate was broken. Todd Bridges was the last one left. The protective big brother was now the only brother. He stood at the funeral, a man who had been written off as dead in 1989, burying the two co-stars who were supposed to be the success stories. While the tragedies of his co-stars played out, a pivotal event occurred in Todd's life that would redefine his public image and, more importantly, his own self-worth. It was an event that proved his redemption was not just about abstaining from drugs, but about a fundamental shift in his character. The date was August 2001. Todd was fishing with his brother at a lake in a park in Los Angeles. Fishing had become his sanctuary, a quiet meditative practice that replaced the chaos of the clubs and the crack houses. While casting his line, he heard a sudden, terrified scream. He looked toward a nearby dock. A woman in a wheelchair had been fishing when her chair rolled too close to the edge. In a horrific instant, she plummeted into the murky water. The woman was Stella Klein. She was a paraplegic. She was strapped into her heavy motorized wheelchair, which was now acting as an anchor, dragging her rapidly to the bottom of the lake. She could not swim. She could not move her legs. She was drowning. Todd Bridges did not freeze. He did not look for a camera. He did not call his agent. He ran. Fully clothed, Todd dove into the water. It was dark and choked with weeds. He swam down, his lungs burning, searching for the woman. He found her, still strapped to the chair, sinking into the silt. He couldn't untangle the straps in the dark water. The chair was incredibly heavy. Adrenaline, the clean, natural kind, not the chemical kind, surged through him. Using brute strength, Todd grabbed the chair and hauled the entire apparatus, with Stella in it, toward the surface. He broke the surface, gasping for air, and dragged the chair to the bank. He pulled Stella Klein onto the grass. She wasn't breathing. Todd began CPR. He worked rhythmically, desperate to force life back into her lungs. She coughed. Water expelled from her chest. She took a breath. She was alive. When the paramedics and the police arrived, they found a soaking wet man tending to a disabled woman. When they asked for his name, he didn't say Willis. He said Todd Bridges. The news cycle the next day was disorienting for the American public. For a decade, headlines about Todd Bridges had always included words like arrested, drugs, trial, or shooting. Now the headlines read, TV star saves paraplegic woman from drowning. Todd Bridges, a real-life hero. It was a narrative shift of seismic proportions. For Todd, it was a validation from the universe. He had taken a life, and he had nearly taken a life. Now he had saved one. Stella Klein later told reporters, "I thanked him, and he just said, 'I'm glad I was there.'" This moment was the bridge between his past and his future. It proved to the world and to himself that he was capable of goodness. He was no longer the junkie in the cell. He was a man capable of selfless bravery. With his sobriety firmly established and his public reputation gradually mending, Todd confronted one last significant challenge: the enduring legacy of his childhood role as Willis Jackson. For 3 decades, he had been overshadowed by this character, which had become a confining stereotype. To progress authentically, he needed to dismantle that persona. In 2010, he released his memoir, Killing Willis, a bold and essential title that symbolized not violence, but a metaphorical liberation from past expectations. It challenged the notion that he would forever remain the wholesome sibling or the troubled former child actor. Within its pages, he candidly shared his personal struggles, including experiences of trauma, substance dependency, legal difficulties, and profound isolation. This honest narrative allowed him to reclaim his story, transforming him from a subject of ridicule into a resilient author and advocate who highlighted the harsh realities of the entertainment world. He resumed acting, not chasing stardom, but embracing meaningful work, such as his recurring portrayal of Monk in the sitcom Everybody Hates Chris, a character that was sharp, humorous, and self-aware, subtly acknowledging his history while demonstrating his growth. Through it all, Todd Bridges emerged from profound adversity, bearing the marks of his journey but standing stronger for it. Having publicly slain the ghost of Willis Jackson through his memoir and redefined his character through an act of heroism at the lake, Todd faced a new challenge, living as a man without a script. The adrenaline of the rescue and the catharsis of the book tour were high points, but life is lived in the valleys. The true test of his character would not be in the dramatic moments that made the news, but in the quiet, unglamorous hours of everyday existence. He had proven he could survive the crash. Now he had to prove he could survive the peace. It was time to trade the identity of the survivor, which implies a constant state of emergency, for the identity of a citizen, a father, and a man simply trying to do the next right thing. By the early 2000s, Todd Bridges had achieved the spectacular. He had survived. But survival is not a destination, it is a daily labor. The dramatic headlines of arrests and acquittals had faded, replaced by the quiet, unglamorous work of long-term sobriety. For Todd, this meant dismantling the ego that Hollywood had built. He had to learn to live as a civilian. The drugs had been a way to numb the pain of his molestation and the sting of his career's collapse. Without the chemical buffer, he was forced to confront his demons in the cold light of day. He found his purpose in service. Todd began traveling the country, not as a celebrity guest, but as a cautionary tale. He visited high schools, juvenile detention centers, and prisons. When he walked into a prison, the inmates didn't see Willis Jackson, the sitcom star. They saw a man who had stood where they stood. They knew he had faced a life sentence. They knew he had been a crack addict. This street credibility gave his words a weight that no guidance counselor could match. "I am not telling you to say no to drugs because it's the law," he would tell them, his voice rasping with the history of smoke. "I am telling you because I have been dead. I have been in the cage, and I am telling you there is a way out." This advocacy became his new addiction. Every soul he reached was another brick in the fortress of his own recovery. He wasn't just saving them, they were saving him. Perhaps the most profound transformation in Todd's life came with fatherhood. He married Dory Smith in 1998 and became a father to a son, Spencer, and a daughter, Bo. For a man whose own childhood was stolen by the industry, a man who was working sound stages when he should have been playing Little League, raising children was a terrifying and healing prospect. Todd was fiercely protective. He looked at his children and saw the innocence that had been stripped from him. The industry came calling, of course. Agents saw the offspring of a famous child star and smelled money. They wanted to know if Spencer wanted to act. They wanted to know if the dynasty would continue. Todd's response was measured but firm. He did not ban them from the industry, but he refused to let them be consumed by it. He acted as the shield he never had. He ensured they had childhoods defined by homework, sports, and friends, not ratings, shares, and table reads. In raising them, Todd had to confront the stage father archetype. He had to ensure he didn't project his own unfulfilled ambitions or his traumas onto them. Every time he hugged his son, he was, in a way, hugging the little boy inside himself, who had been left unprotected in a predator's world. In the modern era of celebrity, the only way for a has-been to remain relevant is often reality television. It is a genre that feeds on conflict and humiliation. Todd Bridges participated in several shows, including Skating with Celebrities and Celebrity Boxing. To the cynical observer, this looked like desperation. But for those paying close attention, a different narrative emerged, particularly during his stint on Celebrity Big Brother. In the house, surrounded by volatile personalities and cameras 24/7, Todd did not crack. He did not revert to the erratic behavior of his youth. Instead, he emerged as the house dad. He was calm. He was a mediator. When conflicts erupted, he was the voice of reason. The public, expecting a train wreck, instead got a masterclass in maturity. They saw a man who had been to hell and was not easily rattled by petty drama. One poignant moment occurred when he defeated Vanilla Ice in a celebrity boxing match. It wasn't about the violence, it was about the discipline. Todd had trained hard. He was physically fit, his body reclaimed from the ravages of crack. Standing in the ring, victorious, he wasn't Willis the junkie, he was Todd the fighter. As the years marched on, the loneliness of his position became more acute. He became the sole custodian of the Diff'rent Strokes legacy. When Conrad Bain passed away in 2013 and Charlotte Rae died in 2018, the circle of silence around Todd tightened. He was the last witness. He was the only one left who remembered the specific smell of the studio in 1978. He was the only one who remembered the inside jokes between takes. He was the only one who knew the true texture of the love and the pain that the cast shared. This status imposed a burden. Every time a retrospective was aired, every time an anniversary occurred, the microphones were thrust at Todd. "Tell us about the tragedy," they would ask. "Tell us about the curse." Todd had to learn to navigate these questions with grace. He stopped denying the tragedy but refused to let it be the only story. He began to emphasize the love. He spoke of Gary Coleman's brilliance, not just his fall. He spoke of Dana Plato's kindness, not just her overdose. He realized that if he didn't tell their stories with dignity, no one would. He became not just a survivor, but a historian of a lost family. In August 2024, Todd faced one of the most significant losses of his life. His mother, Betty Alice Bridges, passed away at the age of 83. Betty was the rock. She was the one who had navigated him into the business, and she was the one who had stood by him when the business spat him out. She sat in the courtroom every day of his trial. She visited him in jail. She never gave up on her son, even when the world told her he was a monster. Her death severed the final tether to his childhood. But unlike the deaths of his co-stars, which sent him spiraling, the death of his mother was met with the grief of a mature man. He honored her. He didn't relapse. He didn't run to a dealer to numb the pain. He stood tall, a testament to the resilience she had instilled in him. He realized that the best way to honor Betty Bridges was to stay clean, to continue being the man she fought for him to be. Now standing as the patriarch of his own life, Todd found himself navigating a new kind of quietude. He was truly unmoored, drifting into the role of the elder survivor. The chaotic noise of his turbulent youth had finally faded into the distance, replaced by the clarity of hindsight. He realized that the torch had been passed. He was no longer the protected child star or the troubled son constantly seeking redemption. He was the history keeper. A new picture emerged, not of a man fighting every day just to stay alive, but of a man who had finally learned how to truly live. The war was over, and the last soldier on the field could finally put down his armor and breathe. In the grand narratives of Hollywood, redemption is often portrayed as a return to the A-list, an Oscar win, a blockbuster movie, a return to the flashing bulbs of the red carpet. But for Todd Bridges, redemption looked entirely different. It looked like normality. As he entered his late 50s and crossed into his 60s, Todd achieved something far more elusive than fame: stability. The chaotic energy that had defined his 20s and 30s had settled into a steady rhythmic hum. He continued to work, appearing in various television shows and films, but the desperation was gone. He was no longer acting to feed a habit. He was acting because it was his profession. He became a regular face on the convention circuit, traveling to Comic-Cons and nostalgia festivals. For years, these conventions had been a source of anxiety. He feared being looked at as a museum exhibit, a relic of a cursed show. But with his sobriety cemented, his perspective shifted. He saw the fans not as gawkers, but as people who had grown up with him. When people approached his table, they didn't ask about the shooting or the crack. They told him, "Willis was my favorite." They said, "You were like the brother I never had." They thanked him for the memories. Todd learned to embrace the legacy of Willis Jackson. He realized that the character wasn't a cage anymore. It was the foundation of a life that had touched millions. He could sign the autograph, smile the smile, and then go home to a quiet house, leaving Willis at the convention center. With the passage of time, the curse of Diff'rent Strokes has been re-examined by cultural historians, and Todd Bridges has been the lead coroner. For decades, the media spun a supernatural yarn about the show, that some dark cloud hung over the cast. Todd Bridges has spent the latter half of his life dismantling this lazy mythology. He argues that there was no curse, there was no magic. There was only the brutal, unregulated machinery of 1970s Hollywood. The curse was a system that allowed a predator to molest a child without consequence. The curse was a labor law system that allowed parents to loot their children's bank accounts. The curse was a medical industry that overprescribed addictive substances to traumatized young adults. Todd stands as the living proof that the curse was actually a series of systemic failures. By surviving, he proves that the tragedy was not inevitable. If there had been better laws, better protection, and better mental health support, Gary and Dana might still be here. He is not just a survivor of addiction. He is a survivor of institutional neglect. His survival indicts the system that destroyed his friends. Today, Todd Bridges is a man at peace. The anger that fueled his youth has evaporated. The fear that defined his addiction has been replaced by faith. He is often asked why he thinks he survived. Why him? Why the one who was deepest in the hole? Why the one who picked up the gun? It is a question that has no easy answer. Perhaps it was the strength of his mother. Perhaps it was the intervention of the legal system that, for once, worked in favor of rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. Perhaps it was simply the random roll of the cosmic dice. But Todd believes it was for a purpose. He survived to be the witness. He survived to ensure that Gary Coleman and Dana Plato are remembered as human beings, not just punchlines. He survived to show that rock bottom is not a burial plot. It is a foundation. Look closely at the two images that bookend this life. On one side, there is the mugshot from 1989, a young man with dead eyes, a war criminal of the drug war, condemned by society, awaiting a cage, written off as garbage. On the other side, there is the man today, a father, a hero who pulled a woman from a lake, a mentor to the incarcerated, the last guardian of a cultural legacy. Why is this paradox happening? How did the bad seed become the good fruit? The world expected Todd Bridges to die. The script was written. The obituary was typed. He was supposed to be the tragedy that made us feel superior. But he refused to read the lines. He flipped the narrative. He walked through the fire of the crack pipe and the ice of the prison cell and emerged not as Willis Jackson, but as himself. The tragic absence of his co-stars leaves a heavy void, but Todd's voice is clear. He stands alone on the stage now, the applause finally for the man, not the character. And so we are left with the final haunting question. Did Todd Bridges survive because he was stronger than the others? Or did he become strong because he was the only one forced to fight for his life?